Picture a moonless night 3,000 years ago. Deep in the mountains of Peru, torches flicker against ancient stone walls as a procession moves silently through narrow corridors. At the center, a small figure walks calmly, adorned in the finest textiles and golden ornaments. This child, no more than 7 years old, has been chosen for the greatest honor their civilization can bestow. Within hours, they will be dead, their life offered to gods who demand the ultimate sacrifice. This is not a tale of primitive brutality, but a window into sophisticated societies that believe the innocent blood of children could ensure their very survival. Before we journey into these dark chapters of human history, we must abandon our modern sensibilities and enter worlds where such acts were not aberrations, but sacred duties. These were not the actions of madmen or monsters, but of deeply religious peoples who constructed elaborate theological frameworks to justify what we now find unthinkable. From the windswept peaks of the Andes to the blood-soaked temples of ancient Carthage, from the ceremonial centers of Mesoamerica to the sacred groves of Celtic Britain, child sacrifice represented humanity's most desperate attempts to communicate with divine forces. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about ancient civilizations. These weren't isolated incidents carried out by barbaric tribes, but systematic practices embedded within some of history's most advanced cultures. We'll explore the intricate rituals, the theological reasoning, and the archaeological evidence that reveals how entire societies organized themselves around the belief that children's lives were currency in cosmic transactions. More disturbing still, we'll uncover how these practices often emerge during times of greatest prosperity, not desperation, suggesting something profoundly unsettling about human nature itself. The scale of what we're dealing with becomes clear when we examine the numbers. Archaeological sites across the globe have yielded thousands of juvenile remains showing clear evidence of ritual killing. At Carthage alone, excavations have uncovered the cremated bones of over 20,000 children, their ashes carefully placed in sacred urns and buried in dedicated cemeteries. In the Andes, frozen mummies of sacrificed children continue to emerge from mountain peaks, so well preserved that we can see the expressions on their faces from their final moments. These discoveries represent only what has survived millennia of decay and destruction. The true scale likely dwarfs what we can measure. Consider the sophistication required to organize such practices. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that could take months or even years to prepare. Children were selected according to strict criteria, often from birth. They underwent elaborate purification rituals, received the finest education their societies could provide, and lived lives of luxury before their appointed time. The logistics alone required massive social coordination, involving priests, craftsmen, astronomers, and political leaders all working toward a single horrifying goal. The Inca civilization of the Andes perfected what they called capacocha, perhaps the most elaborate child sacrifice system ever devised. This wasn't merely a religious practice, but a tool of imperial administration that bound their vast empire together through shared participation in sacred horror. When the Inca emperor faced a crisis, whether natural disaster, military threat, or political instability, he would decree a capacocha ceremony. The response was immediate and empire-wide. From every corner of the Inca realm, children were selected according to precise specifications. They had to be physically perfect, without blemish or deformity. They needed to come from noble families, often the children of local rulers who had been conquered and incorporated into the empire. Most importantly, they had to be beautiful, for the gods demanded only the most aesthetically pleasing offerings. These children, some as young as 6, others approaching adolescence, were brought to Cusco, the imperial capital, in grand processions that could take weeks to complete. The journey itself was part of the ritual. As these doomed children traveled the incredible network of Inca roads, communities along the route were required to provide offerings and participate in ceremonies. The children were treated as divine beings, fed the finest foods, dressed in textiles that took skilled weavers months to create, and adorned with gold and silver ornaments worth fortunes. They lived better during these final weeks than most people in the empire ever would. Yet they knew, with the clarity that only children possess, exactly what awaited them at journey's end. In Cusco, the children underwent final purification rituals in the presence of the emperor himself. They were presented to the mummified remains of previous rulers, symbolically seeking approval from the divine ancestors. Priests conducted elaborate divination ceremonies to determine the most auspicious timing and methods for each sacrifice. Some children would be taken to mountain peaks so high that the thin air would slowly suffocate them. Others would be buried alive in specially constructed chambers. Still others would be given powerful drugs that would ease their transition from life to divine service. The mountain sacrifices reveal the most haunting aspects of Kappa culture. Archaeological expeditions in the 20th and 21st centuries have discovered dozens of these child mummies, frozen in the eternal ice of peaks reaching over 20,000 feet above sea level. The preservation is so complete that we can see not just their faces, but the tears frozen on their cheeks. Some show evidence of having been drugged with chicha beer and coca leaves to dull their fear and pain. Others appear to have faced their fate with a composure that speaks to months of psychological preparation. One discovery stands out above all others. On the summit of Lulailaco, a volcano straddling the border between Argentina and Chile, archaeologists found 3 children who died over 500 years ago. The oldest was a girl of about 15, her hair still braided with colourful threads, her face painted with red ochre in intricate patterns. Beside her lay a boy and a younger girl, all arranged in sitting positions facing east toward the rising sun. Their clothing was pristine, their bodies unmarked by violence. They had simply been left to die in the thin air of the mountain peak. Offerings to Inti, the sun god who demanded such sacrifice to ensure the empire's continued prosperity. What makes these discoveries so disturbing is not just the evidence of systematic child killing, but the clear signs that many of these children went willingly to their deaths. The Inca invested enormous resources in convincing their victims that sacrifice was the highest honor imaginable. Children selected for Kappa culture were told they were becoming divine, that they would serve as intermediaries between the earthly and celestial realms. They were promised that their sacrifice would protect their families and communities from disaster. Many appear to have believed these promises completely. The psychological manipulation required to achieve such compliance reveals a sophisticated understanding of human nature that rivals modern techniques. Children were isolated from their families, surrounded by priests and nobles who reinforced the sacred nature of their fate. They were taught special songs and prayers, given secret knowledge about the gods, and made to feel chosen and special. By the time they reached their final destination, many had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that resistance was unthinkable. This system worked because it served multiple purposes beyond the purely religious. Kappa culture ceremonies were displays of imperial power that reminded conquered peoples of their subordinate status. By demanding the children of local elites, the Inca created a macabre form of hostage system that ensured loyalty. Communities that provided children for sacrifice became invested in the empire's success, for their greatest sacrifice had to have meaning. The ceremonies also provided opportunities for the redistribution of wealth, as the elaborate preparations required massive expenditures that flowed through the imperial economy. The theological framework that justified such practices was equally sophisticated. The Inca believed in a reciprocal relationship with their gods, where human offerings were exchanged for divine protection and prosperity. Children, being pure and unmarked by the corruption of adult life, were considered the most valuable offerings possible. Their sacrifice was seen as a form of communication with deities who controlled the fundamental forces of nature. In a civilization entirely dependent on agriculture in one of the world's most challenging environments, ensuring divine favour was literally a matter of survival for millions of people. Yet even this elaborate theological justification cannot fully explain the psychological mechanisms that allowed entire societies to participate in such horrors. The answer lies in understanding how these civilizations constructed what we might call moral universes, complete systems of meaning where actions we consider monstrous became not just acceptable but necessary, This transformation of values required generations of cultural conditioning, where each new cohort of priests, nobles, and common people inherited beliefs so deeply embedded that questioning them was literally unthinkable. Moving northward from the Andes, we encounter civilizations that elevated child sacrifice to even more systematic heights. The Aztec Empire of central Mexico created what may have been history's most elaborate infrastructure of ritual killing, with children occupying a particularly sacred place in their cosmic order. Unlike the Inca, who viewed child sacrifice as a tool of imperial administration, the Aztecs saw it as fundamental to the very structure of reality itself. The Aztec universe was conceived as perpetually unstable, requiring constant human intervention to prevent cosmic collapse. Their creation myths told of gods who had sacrificed themselves to create the sun, moon, and earth, establishing a divine precedent for human offering. Children representing new life and potential were believed to possess a special capacity to nourish the gods and maintain the delicate balance between order and chaos. This wasn't merely religious belief, but scientific understanding as far as the Aztecs were concerned, supported by complex astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. The festival of Tlacaxi-Pehualistli exemplified this worldview in its most horrifying form. Dedicated to Xipe Totec, the flayed god of agricultural renewal, this ceremony required the sacrifice of numerous children whose tears were believed to bring the spring rains. Priests would spend weeks selecting victims according to precise criteria, seeking children whose emotional responses matched specific requirements. Those who cried abundantly were particularly prized, for their tears were thought to sympathetically encourage rainfall. Those who remained stoic were valued for their bravery, which would transfer to warriors in battle. The preparation process reveals the industrial scale of Aztec ritual murder. Specialized schools trained priests in the complex procedures required for different types of sacrifice. Children destined for agricultural ceremonies underwent months of dietary preparation designed to purify their blood and organs. They were taught elaborate dances and songs that would be performed during their final moments. Artists created costumes and ornaments specifically for their use, often incorporating precious materials that represented enormous investments of labor and resources. Archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor in the heart of modern Mexico City provides stark documentation of these practices. Excavations have uncovered multiple burial chambers filled with the remains of sacrificed children, their bones showing clear evidence of ritual killing. Many skulls bear the marks of precise incisions made by obsidian knives, while others show evidence of drowning or strangulation. The positioning of the remains suggests careful attention to ceremonial protocols, with each body arranged according to specific religious requirements. One chamber contained the remains of over 40 children, all between the ages of 5 and 15, buried with elaborate offerings including jade ornaments, obsidian tools, and ceramic vessels filled with food for their journey to the afterlife. The preservation conditions allowed researchers to determine that many of these children had been well nourished and healthy at the time of death, confirming historical accounts that described how sacrificial victims lived lives of luxury before their appointed end. Some showed evidence of having been drugged, while others appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently, suggesting that even within this system of horror, there were attempts to minimize suffering. The scale becomes even more staggering when we consider the frequency of these ceremonies. Spanish chroniclers recorded that major Aztec festivals could consume hundreds of children in single events, while smaller daily offerings claimed dozens more throughout the year. Conservative estimates suggest that thousands of children died annually in ritual sacrifice across the Aztec Empire, numbers that would have required systematic organization on a scale comparable to modern industrial operations. The psychological impact on Aztec society itself remains one of the most disturbing aspects of these practices. Entire communities became complicit in a system that regularly consumed their own children. Families were expected to feel honored when their offspring were selected for sacrifice, and those who showed reluctance faced social ostracism or worse. Children grew up knowing that they might be chosen at any time, creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear and resignation that shaped every aspect of daily life. Yet perhaps most chilling was the development of what we might call sacrifice culture, where the killing of children became so normalized that it generated its own aesthetic traditions, entertainment forms, and social rituals. Aztec poetry celebrated the beauty of dying children, while artists created elaborate depictions of sacrifice scenes that adorned temples and palaces. Musicians composed songs specifically for use during killing ceremonies, and dancers developed choreographed performances that accompanied the taking of young lives. The theological sophistication that supported these practices rivaled anything produced by medieval European scholastics. Aztec priests developed elaborate theories about the relationship between human sacrifice and cosmic stability, complete with mathematical formulas that calculated optimal numbers of victims required for different purposes. They created detailed anatomical knowledge about how to kill efficiently while preserving the spiritual essence they believed resided in human blood and hearts. This wasn't primitive superstition, but a comprehensive intellectual system that attempted to understand and control the fundamental forces of existence. Moving across the Atlantic, we discover that child sacrifice was not confined to the Americas, but represented a global phenomenon that emerged independently in multiple civilizations. The ancient Mediterranean world produced some of history's most systematic approaches to ritual child killing, with the Carthaginian civilization of North Africa creating what may have been antiquity's most organized infrastructure of juvenile sacrifice. The Topet cemeteries of Carthage present archaeology with one of its most disturbing puzzles. These sacred burial grounds contain the cremated remains of thousands upon thousands of children, their ashes carefully placed in ceramic urns and buried with elaborate grave goods. The sheer scale defies easy explanation, representing what appears to be centuries of systematic child killing conducted by one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. Carthaginian child sacrifice, known as Moloch or Molech offerings, followed patterns that suggest highly developed theological and administrative systems. The selection process favoured children from wealthy families, often the firstborn sons of prominent merchants and political leaders. This wasn't random violence, but calculated religious practice that reinforced social hierarchies while serving supposed spiritual purposes. The wealthy demonstrated their piety and commitment to the community by offering their most precious possessions, while the gods received what were considered the most valuable possible gifts. The ritual procedures reveal careful attention to ceremonial requirements that had been refined over generations of practice. Children were burned alive in bronze statues of the god Moloch, whose hollow interior served as a furnace for human sacrifice. The screams of the dying were masked by the sound of drums and flutes, while priests chanted prayers believed to ensure the victim's safe passage to divine service. The charred remains were then collected, placed in special urns, and buried in dedicated cemetery areas that became focal points for ongoing religious observance. The archaeological record from these topets tells a story that grows more disturbing with each excavation. Researchers have identified distinct phases in Carthaginian sacrifice practices, with evidence suggesting that child killing intensified during periods of military crisis or economic stress. When Carthaginian armies faced defeat, when trade routes were threatened, when natural disasters struck, the response was always the same. More children died in the bronze furnaces of Moloch, their ashes joining the growing collection of urns that documented a civilization's desperate attempts to bargain with divine forces. What makes the Carthaginian evidence particularly chilling is its bureaucratic precision. Each urn was carefully labelled with inscriptions identifying the child within, the circumstances of their death, and the specific divine favour being requested. These weren't acts of religious frenzy, but calculated transactions recorded with the same attention to detail that Carthaginian merchants applied to their commercial ledgers. Some inscriptions explicitly state that the sacrifice was offered in exchange for military victory, successful voyages, or protection from plague. Others record that the offering was made to fulfill vows made during previous crises, creating cycles of obligation that perpetuated the killing across generations. The age patterns revealed in these burials expose another layer of systematic horror. The youngest victims, infants barely old enough to survive outside the womb, were preferred for certain types of divine communication. Older children, those approaching adolescence, were reserved for different ceremonial purposes. This suggests that Carthaginian priests had developed elaborate theories about which ages were most effective for specific types of divine intervention, treating human life as raw material to be optimized for maximum spiritual impact. Roman sources, while certainly biased against their greatest rivals, provide contemporary accounts that confirm the archaeological evidence. They describe Carthaginian nobles competing to offer their children for sacrifice, viewing such acts as demonstrations of superior piety and civic commitment. Families who provided children for the furnaces received special honours and social recognition, while those who attempted to substitute animals or slaves faced public disgrace and divine retribution. The entire social fabric became organised around the systematic killing of the young, creating a civilization where parental love was measured by willingness to murder one's own offspring. The psychological mechanisms that enabled such practices reveal disturbing truths about human adaptability. Carthaginian parents weren't monsters by nature, but ordinary people who had been shaped by cultural systems that redefined moral reality itself. Children grew up hearing stories that glorified sacrifice, watching ceremonies that celebrated the burning of their peers, learning songs that praised the gods who demanded such offerings. By adulthood, participating in child sacrifice felt as natural and necessary as any other civic duty. The theological framework supporting these practices was as sophisticated as anything produced by ancient philosophy schools. Carthaginian priests taught that the universe operated on principles of reciprocal exchange, where human offerings generated divine protection in proportion to their value. Children representing pure potential and innocent life were considered the most powerful currency in these cosmic transactions. Their deaths weren't endings but transformations, turning mortal flesh into divine favour that could protect entire cities from destruction. Yet beneath this elaborate religious justification lay more pragmatic considerations that reveal the true horror of systematic child sacrifice. The killings served to eliminate potential rivals within elite families, concentrating wealth and power among surviving heirs. It demonstrated absolute loyalty to state ideology, identifying families willing to sacrifice everything for communal goals. Most cynically, it provided a mechanism for population control during periods of resource scarcity, removing mouths to feed while claiming divine sanction for what amounted to selective infanticide. Moving northward into Celtic Britain, we encounter child sacrifice practices that reveal yet another variation on this global theme of ritualized horror. The Druids, who controlled religious life across Celtic territories, developed their own distinctive approaches to killing children, embedding such practices within elaborate seasonal ceremonies that marked the rhythms of agricultural life. Unlike the urban civilizations of the Mediterranean or the imperial systems of the Americas, Celtic child sacrifice emerged from tribal societies that maintain more direct connections to natural cycles and seasonal changes. The bog bodies of northern Europe provide some of our most haunting evidence of Celtic sacrifice practices. These naturally mummified remains, preserved in peat marshes for over 2,000 years, include numerous children who died violent ritual deaths. The preservation is so complete that we can see not just their physical features, but the elaborate preparations that preceded their killing. Many show evidence of having been fed special meals before death, their stomachs containing grains and herbs that were reserved for ceremonial purposes. Others bear the marks of careful grooming, with hair braided in complex patterns and skin painted with ritual designs. One discovery stands out for its particular horror. In a bog in Denmark, archaeologists found the remains of a girl no older than 12, her neck bearing the clear marks of a rope that had been used to strangle her. But what made this discovery especially disturbing was the evidence of prolonged preparation. Chemical analysis of her hair revealed that she had been fed a special diet for months before her death, consuming foods rich in specific minerals that were believed to enhance the spiritual power of sacrifice victims. Her clothing, preserved by the bog's unique chemistry, showed intricate embroidery that would have taken skilled craftspeople weeks to complete. The seasonal timing of these Celtic sacrifices reveals a sophisticated understanding of agricultural cycles and their supposed relationship to divine favour. Children were killed at specific moments in the farming calendar when their deaths were believed to ensure successful harvests, favourable weather, or protection from natural disasters. The winter solstice was particularly significant, with archaeological evidence suggesting that multiple children were sacrificed during these darkest days to encourage the sun's return and guarantee spring's arrival. Celtic priests, the Druids whose power extended across tribal boundaries, developed elaborate theoretical frameworks to justify and organise these practices. They taught that children possess special spiritual qualities that made them ideal intermediaries between human and divine realms. Their innocence allowed them to communicate directly with gods who demanded pure offerings, while their youth represented the renewal and potential that agricultural societies desperately needed to survive harsh northern winters. The selection process for Celtic child sacrifice followed patterns that reveal deep social stratification within supposedly egalitarian tribal societies. Children of noble families were preferred, their higher social status translating into greater spiritual value in divine transactions. But unlike other civilizations that focused exclusively on elite offspring, Celtic practices also incorporated children from slave populations captured in warfare. Theirs victims represented different types of offerings, their foreign origins believed to provide access to different categories of divine power. The ritual procedures themselves varied according to seasonal requirements and specific divine purposes. Some children were drowned in sacred pools, their deaths intended to ensure adequate rainfall for crops. Others were burned in great wicker figures, their smoke carrying prayers to sky gods who controlled weather patterns. Still others were buried alive in specially prepared earth chambers, their slow deaths believed to fertilize the soil with spiritual essence that would guarantee abundant harvests. Roman observers, despite their own familiarity with gladiatorial games and public executions, expressed horror at Celtic child sacrifice practices. Julius Caesar wrote extensively about druidical ceremonies that involved burning children alive in massive wooden structures, describing how entire tribes would gather to witness these spectacles that combined religious devotion with community entertainment. His accounts, while certainly influenced by propaganda needs, align closely with archaeological evidence that confirms the systematic nature of Celtic child killing. The psychological impact on Celtic communities themselves created social dynamics that perpetuated cycles of violence across generations. Families who lost children to sacrifice were expected to express gratitude for the honour, while those whose offspring were passed over faced questions about their spiritual worthiness. Children grew up knowing that any seasonal ceremony might claim their lives, creating pervasive anxiety that shaped personality development and social relationships throughout these societies. Perhaps most disturbing was the development of what we might call sacrifice festivals, elaborate multi-day celebrations that combined religious observance with community bonding and entertainment. These events featured not just the killing of children, but elaborate ceremonies, feasts, games, and artistic performances that turned ritual murder into the highlight of the social calendar. Entire communities became invested in practices that consumed their own young, creating cultural momentum that made questioning or resistance almost impossible to contemplate. These ancient civilizations force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and our capacity for collective delusion. From the frozen peaks of the Andes to the bog marshes of northern Europe, sophisticated societies convinced themselves that murdering children was not just acceptable, but sacred. The archaeological evidence leaves no room for denial or rationalization. These weren't isolated acts of madness, but systematic practices that shaped entire cultures for centuries. Perhaps most disturbing of all, these societies didn't see themselves as evil, but as deeply pious, desperately trying to ensure their survival through the ultimate sacrifice. Their legacy challenges us to examine our own moral certainties and ask what seemingly unthinkable practices future generations might discover in our own supposedly enlightened age.